In this module, I basically want to introduce critical discourse analysis as a subset of discourse analysis. So discourse analysis is the linguistic study of anything larger than the sentence or anything larger than a single utterance. And there's basically oral discourse, so studying the way that people speak and use oral language. There's written discourse analysis, how people use writing to create texts. And then there's new discourses. This would be basically something like chatting or text messaging back and forth, things that are a little bit conversation-like. They display a lot of the features we would normally associate with oral discourse, with speaking, but they're also written discourse-like in terms of their permanence or having to use an orthography. So these sort of new media discourses are kind of halfway in between. So within this larger field of discourse analysis, there's a lot of different strands. There's conversation analysis, which is studying the back and forth, studying the way that people work collaboratively or competitively to fight for the floor, to accomplish something in back and forth conversation. There's narrative analysis, which is basically when people leave a conversation to introduce kind of a larger account of events that happened in the past. What does a narrative look like? How do narratives form? There's the study of stylistics, which is basically saying when a speaker or a writer has many, many ways at their disposal to communicate a single piece of information or a single idea, how do they choose which one is appropriate and what are the stylistic consequences? So how does identity inhere in those choices? That's kind of a field of stylistics. We normally think of stylistics as being a property of written discourse, of literature and poetry, and especially, but it can be applied to oral discourse as well. Critical discourse analysis, which we'll be focusing on here, is especially attendant to power dynamics. Who is given power? Who is denied power in a discourse? How are power differentials reproduced in a discourse? These are the central concerns of CDA, of critical discourse analysis. One of the basic premises of critical discourse analysis is that discourses both reflect and constitute ideologies. So the discourses are going to reflect the things that people already believe, the ideologies that people hold. But these discourses will also create, will recirculate, will distribute, will kind of send throughout the world these ideologies as well. So a discourse is a product of an ideology, but a discourse is also the means by which that ideology gets created. And we could also sort of zoom in on what kinds of ideologies I might be doing. Discourses reflect power differentials that pre-exist an act of speaking or an act of writing. Because different groups of people have different amounts of power in a society, the discourses will reflect that. But discourses also become the primary site for sort of reinforcing, recirculating, redistributing those power differentials, making those power differentials appear self-evident, appear as if they are natural, that they're unable to be contested, convincing people that those power differentials should remain in place. Also gender models, so discourses reflect gender identities or gender models. Discourses also shape, they're the thing which creates gender models. And within the field of sociolinguistics, a lot of gender theory, language is one of the main mechanisms through which gender gets created and recirculated, as well as any kind of social relationship. So basically this act or this recognition that discourses are somehow a symptom of a pre-existing trait or pre-existing fact in the society, but discourses are also sort of the means, they're kind of the virus through which these ideas get spread. This double role of discourse makes language particularly interesting to people who are interested in critical theory or power dynamics. One way to kind of get at this is to distinguish capital D discourses from a lowercase d discourses. So a lowercase d discourse would be kind of the way we've been using this word already, a particular instance of speaking or a particular instance of writing. Any discourse is going to often refer to prior discourses. If I have a conversation with you about my birthday party, I might refer to other parties or to last year's birthday party, or I might refer to depictions of birthday party that exists in movies, or perhaps a shared experience of a different party that we both engaged in. This would be intertextuality, where one text is citing another text. What we think of about citations and referencing is just one very formalized system of intertextuality in which one discourse references prior discourses. But some of these discourses seem like they're archetypes that pop up again and again and again throughout a wide range of texts produced by a given community. There's ways of talking about motherhood which begin to seem obvious or self-evident, or ways of talking about immigrants which begin to seem obvious or self-evident. They pop up in a lot of different places. We might think of this as being like a stereotype, but it goes beyond just stereotypical depictions. And these things become true by virtue of being retold so often. Like, people have heard an argument so many times, or have heard a given stance or belief so many times, that it becomes true by dint of frequency. And that these would be the capital D discourses, this sort of larger story which is unchallenged and which is kind of held to be true. And this sort of larger story, this capital D discourse, puts limits on or constrains what sorts of possibilities individual actors have as they craft their lower D discourses. So if I'm going to have a conversation with you about motherhood, that's going to be constrained by what are the ongoing capital D discourses about motherhood? What kinds of things are said about mothers? What are the ways in which they're depicted in our society? What things are appropriate or inappropriate to say or to claim? So there'll be those sort of capital D discourses. This is often seen as being a capital C conversation. Once we narrow it down a little bit, a capital D discourse would be this much larger story that's kind of happening in a society, probably across many decades. A capital C conversation is maybe a little bit more current or a little bit more bound to a given moment in time in a given culture. And this is something where you would kind of see the same conversation being had on a lot of different venues. You would see it in maybe the internet and on radio broadcasts and in newspapers, this larger conversation which is being had. So some capital C conversations which exist would be, there's a conversation about single motherhood, about Americans who live abroad, about the Islamic State, about the role of public radio, about what grammar instruction should look like, about the kind of women who own cats. I mean, these are a sort of discursive figure. These conversations, these topics appear in a lot of different forums, everything from a very informal internet meme to maybe a very formal talk show on a given topic. And these sort of competing capital C conversations can be had. There could be one capital C conversation that sees public radio as the guarantor of free speech and democracy. There could be another capital C conversation in which public radio is seen as this liberal bastion, which is skewing our value of the news. There could be one capital C conversation about grammar instruction, that it's moral and a form of ethical formation that seeks to cultivate order in the world. There could be another capital C conversation about grammar instruction, that it's destructive, that it destroys the psyche, that it can be manipulative or marginalizing to groups of people. So these sort of same sets of stances, these sort of recurring sets of things that people say about a given topic would be these capital C conversations. And it would be impossible to have a lower C conversation, to have an actual conversation about a topic the way that I would see in conversation analysis, without it being overshadowed by these larger capital C conversations happening overhead. In any given conversation I might have with you about public radio, or I might have with you about grammar instruction, I'm going to be either drawing on these pre-existing capital C conversations, or maybe I'll be resisting these capital C conversations, but I'll probably take it for granted that you're familiar with the kinds of things that are already being said, the kinds of discussions that are happening in our society as we talk about a given topic. In this diagram, we can sort of see how these things are nested within each other. We have actual lowercase d discourses, what we might call text, like an oral text or a typed text or handwritten text. This would be a single text, an instance of one person using language to one particular audience at a moment in time, at a certain place, for a certain purpose. These would get embedded within this larger set of discourse practices in the community, the habitual ways that people usually speak and structure this kind of text. if I'm going to send you a text message to invite you to a Thanksgiving meal at my house, that's going to be sort of constrained by the fact that I belong to a community that has certain habits about how we would invite people like you over to an event like a Thanksgiving meal. These rules will impose limits or constraints on the kinds of texts, the kinds of little texts that I'm able to create, the lowercase c conversations I'm able to have, or the lowercase d discourses. And then all of these discourse practices are going to be embedded within this larger set of sociocultural practices which go beyond just language. What are the habitual ways that people relate to each other generally, and which people relate to their environment? So any given text, any given conversation, any given discourse is always going to be embedded within these larger habitual practices of language use. And all of that will be in these larger, even habitual sets of habits, of practices that humans engage in with each other. And these will be community dependent. So you could see this as being the capital C conversations or the capital D discourses that are happening, and this would be much larger sets of social relationships. I've been referring a lot in this unit to that transcribed conversation of Carter and Jack, who were trying to learn Bosnian, and they had a student, Arhan, in a cafe who rebuffed their attempts to use Bosnian, and it turned out that Carter and Jack were right and that the Bosnian student had misunderstood. In that discourse, we could actually analyze this from the lens of critical discourse analysis. So we would ask questions about how is language reflecting and reproducing ideologies? How is the fact that Carter and Jack are having this conversation with each other, to what extent does what they're saying reflect what they already believe, and to what extent does this conversation call new beliefs into existence and cause those beliefs to spread into me as their listener or into other people who might be overhearing? There are certain key ideologies about the English language, speaking normal, for example, or about Americans that exist. The way that they talk about English, the way they talk about Americans is both a symptom of the way that people generally talk about English or generally talk about Americans, but it's also a chance for them to exercise agency and to try to create new ways or to spread these existing ways of thinking. There's ideology about Bosnia and Bosnians. There's ideologies that are inherent in this conversation about how language acquisition happens for speakers who are trying to learn a language as adults. This conversation is very revealing in terms of what they already believe, but it also might be that having this conversation causes them to realize something about adult language acquisition that either they themselves didn't have or that each other was new information to each other. There's ideologies about masculinity, so what a guy should do, how a guy talks, how a guy confronts situations. There's power relations that are inherent between the different actors who are in this story. There's social relationships as well between Jack and Carter, between Jack Carter and Arhan and Boris, as well as between me, the outside interviewer. So all of these things would sort of be from a critical discourse analysis lens what I would want to attend to, and how pausing, how discourse markers, how lexical choice, how sentence construction, how fronting, topicalization, how all of those language choices become windows through which we can see into these ideologies, and how this transcribed conversation itself becomes a site whereby all of these ideologies and beliefs are made self-evident or are reproduced, are recirculated in the society.